Hello, welcome everybody to the first edition of the Task Us Forward webinar series. Thank you so much everybody who's taken time out of your day to join us today. For those of you in the trust and safety community, I know there's a number of events on today, all of them at conflicting times, but we really appreciate you taking the time to come spend an hour with us today. My name is Phil Tomlinson. I lead the content security team here at Task Us. So I've spent most of the last 10 years really immersed in the content moderation space. I started with Twitter in, when was it? Early 2012, right at a critical inflection point where social media use and smartphone use exploded, right? It took off in tandem. So I spent about 5 years there helping to build out Twitter's global safety operations. In 2017, I made the move from the platform side to the services side. And I joined Cognizant, large multinational provider of content moderation services at the time, headed up their content operations practice for a number of years before joining Task Us a little over a year ago. The biggest challenges in those really early days of Twitter were mostly around spam and adult content. Then in around 2013 and 2014, we began to see a pretty noticeable shift. And if any of you have followed Twitter's story over the years, this probably won't surprise you, but the abuse and harassment in particular of prominent women on the platform, of minorities, and of marginalized groups, protected groups, became a primary concern. From there, we saw the rise of ISIS and those really awful execution videos, and struggled with finding delicate moderation balance, taking into account how visceral is the content, the intent of the user who posted it, the newsworthiness of the event, even the wishes of the family of the deceased in some cases. So, really complex, nuanced, and evolving challenges. And you fast forward to today, and there are once again new emerging content challenges. And as content moderators, as a community of trust and safety professionals, we're being asked to meet these challenges head on. So this brings us really neatly to today's webinar and our topic, which is flattening the curve of disinformation. So in a few moments, you're going to hear from our keynote guest, Mark Little. Mark is the CEO and co-founder of Kinzen. They're a Dublin-based startup that aims to protect online communities from the threat of disinformation. Before Kinzen, Mark founded the world's first social media news agency, Storyful, which really pioneered digital verification techniques and developed news wires for YouTube and Facebook. They were eventually acquired by News Corporation. I also had the great privilege of working closely with Mark for several years at Twitter, where he was VP for Media Partnerships, and he was the site lead for our Dublin office. So as Mark mentioned in his intro video, he's going to attempt to kind of unravel some of those origins of online disinformation, follow its evolution over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. And I think most importantly, land at a place that shows us the way forward. How do we beat this? How do we at least get ahead of it? How do we flatten that curve? After Mark's keynote, I'll come back in and I'll join Mark for an informal chat about how content moderation practices are evolving to address this threat of disinformation. So this is a live webinar. We're not pre-recording this. There's no canned content, kind of living on the edge here, baby. We encourage you to send questions. You can use the little Q&A widget at the bottom of the Zoom app. Mark and I will do our best to answer some of these towards the end of the session. And hopefully we'll get to as many of those as we can in the just under an hour that we have. So that's all the preamble. That's all the housekeeping out the way, I think. So let's get on to the good stuff. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Mark Little.
Phil, it is an absolute pleasure, and thank you for giving us, as we say in Ireland, the loan of the hall. I think it's fantastic to be able to bring together people who are probably, toiling away on in their own platforms and their own communities, trying to protect them. But be able to come together, I think, is first of all an incredible resource. So thank you, Phil. Thank you, Task Us. What I want to do is talk a little bit about something that I think we kind of don't really understand about disinformation sometimes when we think about it. We obviously think about, if you're in the trust and safety community, you've got so much else to worry about before you even think about disinformation, that disinformation is seen to be a kind of another thing you've got to worry about. I would argue that a lot of the threat that Phil talks about, particularly online hate, the connective tissue sometimes linking all these groups together, linking a lot of the abuse that we're dealing with, is deception. I'd also define disinformation as like organized campaigns of deception. It's not just people saying crazy things or, you know, friends and family sharing things that are wrong. It's people who are trying to deceive communities in order to create real world harm. So that's really a big definition. I think the final thing I say before I take you down maybe memory lane a little bit is that disinformation didn't just emerge over the past year. It didn't just come out of the Capitol Hill riot. It's been building, I think, for more than a decade, and certainly in my experience, to become, I think, as I say, that connective tissue that links a lot of the issues around content security, online harm, and obviously the way that we think about our communities going forward. So as Phil said, I've been working in this field. I was so lucky to work with Phil at Twitter. Long before that, I'm going to take you down memory lane because I'm going to show you a few slides. I won't take too long. Hopefully I'll be able to tell you a little bit of a personal story as you take you through my particular journey. So I'm going to show you a photograph, and I'm going to do this for a couple of reasons. I hope you can see this. This was the very first publicity shot taken of me when I started out as a journalist 30 years ago for the Irish national television station, RTE. I showed this picture for two reasons. One, obviously I haven't changed a bit in those 30 years, but more importantly, I want to just illustrate the core and the origin of the problem, disinformation. So first of all, it's about technology and how technology has influenced the way that we create and share and consume information. Like way back when, this is 1991, if you look even behind me there, those are reel-to-reel tapes. We used to cut with with razor blades. There were magnetic tapes we put together into radio programs long before podcasts. That internet terminal right there, it's dumb. It's not connected to the internet. That phone I'm holding, it's a rotary phone, and it's not mobile in any particular way. If I think in my career, the change that has happened in the way information is distributed, I come to today, when there is unlimited people out there creating, you know, large bodies of really quality content, but, you know, millions of podcasts every year, 500 hours of video, minutes of video loaded every minute on YouTube now. And so there's an unlimited amount of content in the lives of ordinary people. They are overwhelmed by content today. It's no longer scarce. And in the old days, people like me, this was me in Iran as a foreign correspondent. I was also a war correspondent for a long time. It was up to me as the gatekeeper to tell the audience what to believe, what to trust, what to pay attention to. Today, the power has been transferred to the people, to ordinary people. So this was, for example, during 2009, a light bulb moment that made me leave journalism, go into the business I'm in now, when young people like this woman were covering a big event in Iran that year, which was an aborted revolution against the mullahs there. And it was really individuals like this who told that story using camera phones, connected to platforms like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. There was no longer any gatekeeper. So overwhelming information and no more filters, no more gatekeepers like me as a journalist. As a result, we became dependent on algorithms to tell us what to watch. And, you know, algorithms by definition are supporting advertising and different business models. They are optimized for emotion. They're optimized to show us things that make us feel happy or sad or something, just to get us to share. So these gatekeepers now are automatic. And I think that's the basis of the problem. People have exploited the fact that we're all overwhelmed. There's no real formal gatekeeper anymore, and that's where disinformation starts. So back in the day when I left journalism, I left as a TV anchor. I went and formed a team called Storyful, as Phil has already mentioned. And maybe I'll just show you a little bit of video to tell you what we did. We were the first social media news agency. We were out there verifying back in 2011 during the Arab Spring, the beginning of that era. And this is what we did. A little video, tell you a bit more about Storyful.
We are part of a golden age of journalism and storytelling. Everybody now is a storyteller. There's hundreds of hours of YouTube video uploaded every single minute. But when everybody's telling a story, which stories are worth listening to?
Storyful's first social media news agency in the world.
One of the big stories we've been covering today is Yemen. We found this pretty dramatic video. So what we want to do is go to Google Maps, establish the location. We find the building here, which matches exactly. And now we're going to attempt to get clearance for the content and provide it to our clients for use. Hi, my name is Joe Galvin. I'm a journalist with the news agency Storyful.com.
So that's what we were doing. We were using old-fashioned journalism to go to places like Tahrir Square in Egypt. This is where this image is from, in the early days of the Arab Spring. And initially, we were verifying really joyful and liberating images that were coming across platforms like YouTube. We worked for YouTube, we worked for Facebook as moderators and as analysts. And initially, the imagery from the Arab Spring was all about people taking democratic power in their hands and expressing themselves. For example, back to Iran, as you can see, it's an obsession of mine, where we were seeing Facebook groups of women challenging the hijab in a very celebratory way. So the democratic potential of the internet was something hasn't gone away. It was something that Storyful was set up to liberate and to verify. Problem is, around 2012 and 13, we start to realize that the platforms were being weaponized. They were actually becoming another form of warfare. So on the left-hand side here, for example, you see the Israeli Defense Forces back in 2013 warning reporters to stay away from Gaza, to stay away from Hamas. Next tweet up is from the armed wing of Hamas, the Al-Qassam brigades, warning reporters to stay away from the Israelis. So war by one mean. On the other side, as Phil has already mentioned, we as content moderators were starting to see the most horrific imagery appearing from ISIS, then based in Syria. So we started to see war and elite groups using social media to spread these images. About 2013, we started to see something very interesting. I think this, perhaps on the left-hand side, is the first really powerful image of disinformation that I can remember seeing. 2013, I know Phil was experienced from the other side in Twitter when this happened, where the AP's Twitter account was hacked and someone posted a false message saying that Barack Obama was injured in a bomb attack on the White House. Below that tweet, you can see the impact on the stock market. So this was the first, I think, really important piece of disinformation that had an obvious real world impact. At Storyful, we were also seeing when, an accident would happen, in this case, a tragic downing of an airliner, we would see certain state actors trying to blame this kind of accident on their enemies. We were also seeing certain state actors trying to avoid responsibility for things like the downing of the Malaysian airliner. We were at Storyful investigating the disinformation surrounding that particular action. And what was in common in this first wave of disinformation, it was top down. It was generally groups that had already some power, and they were trying to deceive people for their political ends. Now, what they were doing, and this probably takes us all the way up to 2016 with the rise of Donald Trump, what these kind of groups and people like Steve Bannon, the strategist behind Trump's campaign, were trying to do, they didn't need to persuade anybody that what they were saying was true. They just needed to persuade people that everything they saw on the internet was a lie. They were basically setting out to reduce the level of trust in everything we see on the internet. This is according to Jay Rosen, who's a great media critic I believe in. So this was the first wave of disinformation from the top down, creating distrust across everything. Now, I would argue we're now entering into a different era of disinformation. And in the second wave of disinformation, it's not so much top down, it's bubbling up from the bottom. And essentially what's happening now more and more, we're starting to see, I'll give you one example. Last year, when we started to see the COVID outbreak and lockdown happening, we started to see a really interesting conspiracy theory, which was coronavirus caused by the 5G network. Now, initially, this was just chatter. A few people on the internet saying this all the way through January, February, and March. But what happened then was on Twitter, and this is an example of some data that we saw from the Signal Labs, showing us this inflection point. This is a super spreader event. And this is why I think we should start to see disinformation as a virus. We have a chatter, probably insignificant. If I was a content moderator or a trust and safety team, I wouldn't intervene at that low level of chatter. But you see this inflection point. In this case, it was a rapper in the UK who took this crazy theory and sent it out to all its followers. And that then suddenly was picked up by other celebrities. So this is a virus from the bottom up that requires a super spreader to communicate this to a mainstream community. Now, we started to see this on steroids when we started to analyze the QAnon movement. So here you see, for example, a very innocuous statement, save the children. Now we can see as moderators that that person is wearing a slogan of QAnon, so we can spot this and we can say, right, this particularly innocuous statement is associated with a known conspiracy theory. But that's not the way it works in practice for most people who are radicalized. They may see that slogan appearing in a marketplace. They may see it appearing in a craft platform or in a bookshop online. The more that we move into the online world, every conversation, every community is now vulnerable to this kind of innocuous form of conspiracy theory that seems to be something harmless, but turns out to be very different. We started to see, for example, that slogan, QAnon, appearing on t-shirts. We started to see that slogan infecting communities on Instagram that were dedicated to wellness and yoga. Got to the point where those communities in yoga, for example, started to fight back. And I think this is something that inspires me. As we start to think about disinformation, not as a top-down phenomenon, but a bottom-up phenomenon, it's really thinking about how we flatten the curve by empowering communities, creating transparency around this kind of activity. And that's got to be the focal point. So I know I'm going to finish off now and go back to Phil. We've got a lot to talk about, but I'll finish off just with a couple of observations about potential solutions, right? It's a wicked problem, which means, you know, human solutions don't necessarily scale, but algorithms can detect the agile, fast-moving nature of disinformation. So we need some machine and human combination, and that's what we focus on at Kinsen. We've been developing data and intelligence services for trust and safety teams and content moderation teams. We're very proud to partner with TaskUs around trying to find ways to build human in the loop systems where we're not just trying to replace humans with algorithms. We're trying to develop technology that exponentially amplifies the power of the human. So for example, we're now taking advantage of major breakthroughs in transcription and translation technologies that allow us to, you know, scour thousands of hours of video and audio. We're also starting to see that small amounts of very precise data can train far more effective machine learning solutions than simply throwing loads of data at the wall and seeing what sticks. Because remember, this is not about spam or copyright or even pornography. Algorithms cannot detect the speed with which this moves. And finally, I would just pay tribute maybe to some folks out there who are listening who have done great work. And I think, you know, I have a conflict of interest. I'm a former Twitter executive. I love what Twitter did by trying to create some friction for ordinary people. So empowering ordinary people with transparency around information to make decisions themselves. And I think that will be one of the core features of this next wave of responses to disinformation, where we think about decentralizing power to the communities that we're here to protect. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, get back to Phil, because I know we got a lot to talk about. But thanks for your patience with that. I hope that was an entertaining journey.